Welcome to my presentation on Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was a very bright young man. He had some humble beginnings. His father was a sharecropper in Georgia, and his grandfather was a minister at a very small church in the area. But he was a bright young man. He skipped the 9th and 11th grades and actually started attending college at the age of 15. When he graduated from Morehouse College, he went on to Crozier Theological Seminary to study how to be a minister. And at that school, he was the valedictorian upon graduation, and he was the student body president. He did not stop his education there. He actually went on to Boston University to get his doctoral degree. And after all of that education, he actually returned to Alabama while he was working on his dissertation and became a pastor. His work was not just at the pulpit in his church. However, as we all know, he became a pretty active civil rights leader. One of the very first things that he got involved in was the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott that followed the arrest of Rosa Parks when she refused to give her seat up on the bus. He was involved in several other nonviolent protests, which led to the creation in 1957 of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was an organization of civil rights activists and leaders that focused on nonviolent protest. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to be involved in the nonviolent protests, one in 1960 where he was famously arrested, and even more famously was his arrest in 1963 during his nonviolent protest in Birmingham, Alabama. This protest resulted in quite a bit of brutality when the police turned dogs and fire hoses on the protesters despite them being nonviolent. He was arrested for that protest, and he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. Probably his most famous speech is the I Have a Dream speech, which was given in 1963 at the March on Washington. This is what really, he was already a national figure, but this definitely put him in the spotlight as a national civil rights activist and leader. He continued to be involved in quite a few protests and activist marches, one being in 1965. There was a famous protest in Selma, Alabama, where a bunch of people were crossing a bridge to stage a protest, and they were stopped by the local authorities, and they were brutally beaten. It's known as Bloody Sunday. After that, there were several other protests. The third one, Martin Luther King Jr. actually participated in. He did not participate in the famous Bloody Sunday protest, but he did follow it in the subsequent. He was involved in the subsequent protests. He continued to be very active in the community. He started to expand his focus of what he was an activist for in those later years, and he actually started to not just advocate for the rights of people in the South, which is where much of his work was focused, but he started to look north, and the treatment of Black communities and Black peoples in the North, namely Chicago, was one of those areas, and he became a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. In 1968, on April 3rd, 1968, King gave a very famous speech called "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And there's a really striking line in that speech, given the context of what happened the next day. So that line is, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." That's a pretty famous line in that speech, and it stands out because the very next day is the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, as he was at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was shot by James Earl Ray. And this picture here is actually a picture from that site, and they're pointing to where they believed the gunman to be. If you ever have a chance to travel down to Memphis, Tennessee, they have actually preserved Martin Luther King Jr.'s room as it was on the day of the assassination. They've opened up those curtains so you can look into his room and see just what it was like on that very day. It's a very striking thing, and you can actually walk across the street and go into the building where James Earl Ray was thought to have been located when he fired that shot. These are the sources that I used to conduct my research, and that is it. Thank you for listening.